Hello everyone, and welcome back to our lunchtime series of webinars delivered by staff in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Chester in the UK. I'm Wendy Dossett and I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing this event. Our vision with these webinars is to support schools and colleges at this difficult time by offering free talks on aspects of the A-level religious studies curriculum. Each lecture is streamed live from our homes. We're grateful to the university's Learning Technology team for helping make this possible. We think this series represents some of the special features of TRS Chester. Our drive to use our expertise to support communities outside of the university and to make a difference. Our passion for our subject, our commitment to supporting RE in schools, our dedication to students and to making learning both relevant and fun. If you want to find out more about the kind of department we are and the degrees that we offer, please visit our website. We really hope you love our webinars. Please do mention them on Twitter at TRS Chester and using the hashtag A-level-RS webinar. So let me now introduce the 9th speaker in our series, Associate Professor in Feminist and Contextual Theology, Dr. Hannah Bacon, who's going to discuss whether Christianity is irredeemably sexist. Hannah joined the department in 2004. Her PhD explored the doctrine of the Trinity and how feminist theology might engage with this doctrine beyond asking questions about inclusive language. Her more recent research focuses on how Christian ideas about sin and salvation resurface in secular weight loss culture. After doing fieldwork inside a UK slimming group, she argues in her latest book that Christian theology can be used to resist fat phobia and challenge the politics of sizeism. Hannah, thank you for speaking to us about this key topic on the A-level curriculum. We'll hear from you for about 30 minutes and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. Just to reassure the audience, we at Chester can't see or hear you, and nor can anyone else. To ask a written question in the chat, you just need to hover your mouse over the screen and then click the icon that looks like a speech bubble with a question mark in it. Please make sure that you ask questions anonymously. You can also upvote the questions that you like, as well as asking your own, and I'll take that into account as I field questions to Hannah after her talk. So Hannah, in a moment, the screen will be yours.
Hi everybody, welcome to this live webinar. Welcome to my study. I have a very young dog who is circling the vicinity, so if you hear her barking, then it's not me, it's the dog. So welcome, let's look at this really interesting and incredibly difficult question actually about whether Christianity is irredeemably sexist. And let's just note that the question isn't just asking whether Christianity is sexist, it's actually asking whether Christianity is irredeemably sexist. So are we to chuck it in the bin? Are we to abandon Christian faith altogether? Are we to exit the church because it's so dangerous to stick around? Difficult terrain. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover. So we've got 30 minutes, so we've got to kind of speed through some stuff. So I hope you can stay with me as I kind of go through this at quite a bit of speed, really. So we'll start by asking the question, what is sexism? Draw some examples from our everyday kind of experiences, but we'll also draw some examples from Christianity. Obviously, we haven't got time to start listing the endless examples of sexism within Christianity. We'll just look at a few of those. And then we'll start to look at the question in a little bit more detail. We'll turn to our first speaker, if you like, Daphne Hampson, who I know appears on some of your syllabi. Daphne Hampson, a British feminist theologian who's really kind of built a career actually around saying that Christianity is irredeemably sexist. So what is her position and what reasons does she give for it? We'll look at that. And then what are the difficulties with her position? You know, I want to say that even though Daphne Hampson has got a lot right in her assessment, that actually she's also got a lot wrong, that her position is limited. So on what grounds do I want to argue that? So I'll just say something about that. And one of the things that Hampson really kind of hones in on is the maleness of Jesus. You know, she does see this as an unsurmountable problem. So is it an unsurmountable problem? Mary Daly, another really famous Catholic feminist theologian from America, definitely wants to agree with Daphne Hampson and give her a bit of a high five. She's got it right. But Rosemary Radford Ruther, a Christian feminist, another Catholic Christian feminist, absolutely not. Mary Daly and Daphne Hampson together have actually got it wrong, and the maleness of Jesus is not an insurmountable problem. In fact, people like Hampson and Daly, who focus exclusively on the maleness of Jesus, are misunderstanding his significance altogether. And then Jacqueline Grant we'll end with. Jacqueline Grant is an African-American, a womanist theologian, and that simply means that she's an African-American womanist theologian, so she's a black woman speaking about her own black experience about living in America, and she brings a very different angle to the question. So we've got a lot to get through. Overall, as you'll see from the conclusion on the screen, I want to say that Christianity is sexist, but it's not irrecoverably sexist, that there are good theological reasons for resisting sexism, and I'll say more about that as we move through. So what is sexism? We might say that sexism is a form of gender-based prejudice or discrimination, which assumes that women are inferior to men. It's also a form of gender-based oppression, and I think talking about sexism as a form of oppression is really important, because what oppression says is that gender-based privilege is harmful, and it's a form of injustice against women and injustice against girls across the globe. This is a global problem. In a time where we're talking about global pandemics, we might want to think about sexism as such a kind of disease in many ways. And many feminist theologians have made this point about sexism being this kind of toxic disease, if you like. Elizabeth Johnson and Rosemary Radford Ruther appear on the screen there. Elizabeth Johnson, both of these feminist theologians are alive and well. Elizabeth Johnson writes this brilliant book, She Who Is, and she defines sexism in this text as a persistent violation of women's humanity and an omnipresent paradigm of unjust relationships. It's persistent. It keeps going. Generation after generation, it's transmitted, therefore, and it's omnipresent. It's everywhere. It's really hard to find a space outside of it. And Rosemary Radford Ruther kind of agrees with her. She writes a really important text, Sexism in God Talk, which many of you will have read bits of. Sexism for Ruther describes gender privilege of males over females, so both giving us really sensible definitions there and important definitions. At the top of the screen, you can also see that I've wanted to identify that sexism isn't just a personal problem. So sexism isn't just about individuals having sexist opinions, views, values, beliefs. It's also about practices and actions, but it's also about systems and structures. So it's in society, in the way that society is organised, in who gets to be Prime Minister, in who runs the health service, who gets access to the health service, who gets access to insurance, what are students taught at school, what are they encouraged to learn at school, as well as personal attitudes and personal opinions about women, which may be derogatory. On the next slide here, you'll see that I've put some everyday examples of sexism. I don't know if you can see my mouse there, but this link to the Everyday Sexism Project I'd really encourage you to have a look at that. It's brilliant because, you know, people like you and me who experience sexism on a kind of in a run-of-the-mill kind of way in our day-to-day lives, we can kind of upload these instances onto the Everyday Sexism Project, and that is therefore creating a kind of bank of sexist instances within everyday life so that we can really get a sense of the problem. So take a look at that if you're interested. But there's some other images on the screen here. So we've got an image of women footballers. There's been a lot in the press over the last year or so about women footballers being paid a lot less than their male counterparts. They're not getting equal access to prize money, or they're not getting enough kind of equal amounts, should I say, of prize money. Below that image, we've got an image of Libby Lane, who is the first woman to be ordained as a bishop in the Church of England back in 2015. She was the Bishop of Derby, first of all, and you know, let's just remember that actually the route to ordination within the Church of England has not been easy for women, first as priests and now as bishops. It's been a long time coming, and it's still difficult say more about that in a second. And then back to an everyday example at the top right hand side there, this idea that, you know, women are still in a minority in the boardroom. I think a recent study has women across the globe as only occupying 16.9% of board seats across the globe. That's pretty appalling, we might want to say. And then back bottom right, sorry, where you've got that picture of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The way that Eve has been presented within Christianity has often been very derogatory to Eve and then to women after her. Eve, traditionally, according to many really famous Christian theologians like Augustine, like Aquinas, who we've probably read in different contexts already for our A-level studies, had really kind of outspoken views about women, not good, should I say, outspoken views about women, and wanted to say that Eve actually was more responsible for sin in the Garden of Eden than Adam. You get people like Augustine saying that, you know, Eve basically tempted him. She alone spoke to the serpent, he says, and she alone was seduced by him. This idea that she kind of lures Adam into disobedience and trips him up. Augustine and others also believed that Eve was the weaker sex, and, you know, he, like other Christian theologians, uses the Bible, 1 Timothy 2 in particular, to support his position. And then what we have is a kind of transmitting of that kind of discourse about that kind of narrative about women down the centuries. Eve as being the weaker sex, Eve as being responsible for sin, and this kind of gets attached to women and regurgitated, and it's certainly been a very lucrative tool for the advertising industry, where that trope of women as temptress and women as disobedient and sexually kind of alluring to men has been used to sell things. Katie Edwards is a British feminist theologian working at Sheffield. She's got a lot of good things to say about that. Anyway, that quotation by Lisa Isherwood at the bottom kind of sums things up, really, in many ways. Lisa Isherwood is a British feminist theologian working in Winchester, and she says at each turn in the Christian narrative, women are systematically excluded or defined as inferior. Indeed, much of the Christian story depends on the truth of women's inferiority. So, you know, if we take all that on board, it doesn't actually look particularly good. And of course, there are other examples. We might want to think about the maleness of God in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The way that the Bible doesn't seem to include very many women, certainly not in speaking parts, as it were. There's lots that we could have a look at, but let's have a look at what Daphne Hampson has got to say about why Christianity is irredeemably sexist. She writes this, well, she puts together this edited collection in the mid-1990s, Swallowing a Fishbone, which is absolutely brilliant, where she's asking this question: is Christianity irredeemably sexist? And she starts off with this chapter, which just packs a punch, and it's basically her laying out section by section, you know, premise by premise, why Christianity is irrecoverable and why women have to get out. And she says this: for a feminist to be a Christian is indeed for her to swallow a fishbone. It must stick in her throat. You know, if you've ever had a fishbone in your throat, it's not a pleasant experience. You're kind of coughing and wanting to hack it up. You want to get it out. And she's kind of like thinking that Christianity to the feminist is a bit like that. It's very uncomfortable. And the best thing that women can do is get a slap on the back by a friend and get it out. Cough it out. It's not good for you. So there's no way back for Daphne Hampson, according to Daphne Hampson, from for feminists. If feminists are committed to the full humanity of women, then Christianity is untenable. So why, on what grounds does she make this position? So for Hampson, as it says on the screen, the overarching problem is the fact that Christianity is an historical religion. What does she mean by that? Well, she means that Christianity claims that there's been a particular revelation of God in history, that God has been revealed through a particular man, Jesus, at a particular time to a particular people. And this history, she says, is indispensable. We can't get rid of it. And we can't get rid of it because it's not just something which belongs to the history books. It's something that Christians can continue to see as authoritative in the here and now, and more than that, as normative for the here and now. So what's so problematic about this particular revelation of God in history and this particular man, Jesus, in his significance? and the particular people and the particular time in which God is said to have revealed God's self. Well, according to Daphne Hampson, the problem is that that particular time that's said to be revelatory is patriarchal, male dominated. And if that time becomes authoritative and normative to the here and now, then doesn't that mean that patriarchy is also authoritative and normative in the here and now? She says it absolutely does. And for feminists, that's a fishbone in the throat. That is not good. So she wants to say that that is problematic. So let's break this down. So there are three related issues for Daphne Hampson. The first is the historical time, which is indispensable to Christianity, that it sees as normative and authoritative in the here and now, is male dominated, it's patriarchal. And this, she says, validates therefore patriarchal society and gives it, in fact, the divine seal of approval, because let's remember, she says, God is choosing this for God's self as the appropriate time in which to reveal God's self, to disclose who God is in a patriarchal time. This makes God look like God supports patriarchy. Second issue for Hampson. Christians believe that God became flesh in the historical person of Jesus, and that flesh is male flesh. So doesn't that mean that God becomes male, and therefore that God somehow chooses maleness as a more fitting body for his disclosure? She wants to say it certainly does. And the crux of the point for Hampson surrounds the uniqueness of Jesus. She is of the view that for Christians to be Christian, they have to confess the uniqueness of Jesus. They've got to believe that God has become manifest, made flesh, incarnate, to use the technical term, in Jesus in a way that is not possible and never will be possible for anyone else. Let's hear from her in her own words. So she says, Christians, this is not on the screen, but just listen. Christians must say of Jesus that there was a unique revelation of God through him in a way in which this is not true of you or me. And if Jesus is male and God chooses to reveal God's self uniquely through a male body and that cannot be repeated in you or me, then that seems to suggest, according to Hampson, that God prefers maleness as a form of self-disclosure. Problem. Third problem for Hampson, the collection of sacred texts called the Bible, which tell the story of God's intervention into human history, are also androcentric, male-centered, that means. And she says, well, let's just remind ourselves that women don't really appear very much in this collection of texts. It hardly mentions women, she says, and speaks about God mainly in male terms. Problem. So for Hampson, all of those things together make Christianity quite an untenable religion for feminists. To return us to the top quotation for a feminist to be a Christian is for her to swallow a fishbone. It must stick in her throat. But is she right? I want to argue that she's not right. And it's not that what she says is completely wrong. It's just that it needs kind of expanding. It's limited. One of the reasons that it's limited is that she seems to see Christianity and feminism as quite fixed entities and as homogenous. Christianity is this. For example, all Christians have to believe in the uniqueness of Jesus, otherwise they're not Christian. Is that the case? She also seems to think that feminism is also quite fixed and static. Well, let's just look at that. You know, Christianity has always understood itself as a living tradition. If we think about things that are alive, think about our gardens, our children, ourselves, then those things grow, they change, they develop, they adapt. If Christianity is a living tradition, then it's used to growing, adapting and changing. It's not this static, fixed thing. Hampson's wrong about that. And she seems to imply that it's static and fixed, and it's not. It's a living tradition. And feminism equally is a developing movement. It's not static and it's not fixed. It's evolving. Christianity has changed its views about a number of things over the centuries. Think about slavery. You know, there was a time when the Bible and its views about slavery were used to justify the enslavement of black people. And we've heard something about that in the Black Lives Matter campaign and movement. But most Christian churches now, not all, most Christian churches now think that that's diabolical and not the word of God at all. So Hampson's probably wrong about the way that she frames Christianity and feminism as being quite static and homogenous. I also think Hampson's not quite right because she seems to assume that the decision to stay or leave the Christian faith is one which is purely rational and based on reason alone. It's almost like she's saying that there's this kind of like metaphorical Rubik's Cube that feminist Christians have to get hold of and twist, and if they can't resolve it, then they need to chuck it away. Well, for most feminist Christians, this is not the thing. You know, Christian believers are Christians because they have experienced something liberating and meaningful about Christian faith. And the fact that women stay is probably because they've experienced something liberating about the Christian faith. And we've got to take that seriously. We've got to listen to that and really understand it. And Hampson doesn't seem particularly bothered about A, asking the question, or B, hearing the response. Just to say that, you know, I have put Nicholas Lee down there, I've put Janet Soskis down there. If you're interested in looking at feminist theologians other than me who've made similar points, and these are references that you can follow up. Thirdly, there are good theological grounds for resisting sexism and other forms of domination and oppression. I really do think that this is definitely the case. And one of the theological grounds is that, you know, we only need to kind of look back to Genesis to see that women and men, male and female, are made in the image of God, imago Dei. Women are fully made in the image of God, fully imago Dei. And if that's the case, then anything that compromises this kind of dignity of women is not just a problem for feminists, it's actually a problem for Christians. It's an assault on God's creation. We might want to say it defaces God's creation. So sexism isn't just a problem for feminists, it's actually not Christian. And I certainly want to make that point. Other feminist theologians have said similar things. Ruther makes the point in Sexism and God Talk. Johnson makes the point in She Who Is. And let's just look at what Johnson actually says. So she says women are equally created in the image and likeness of God, equally redeemed by Christ, equally sanctified by the Holy Spirit. Women are equally involved in the ongoing tragedy of sin and the mystery of grace, equally called to ministry in this world, equally destined for life with God in glory. So anything that refuses that equality and that full humanity of women, Johnson argues, is sin, and Ruther certainly wants to agree with that. For Johnson, sexism also breaks the commandment to love thy neighbour as thyself, and she talks a little bit about that. So there are good theological grounds for resisting sexism. The imago Dei, theology around the image of God, that is one example, but it's not the only example. And then finally, at the end there, I've said, does a Christian have to believe that Jesus, the man, is the only expression of God in time? Must the maleness of Jesus be a stumbling block? This is quite a massive question. Anybody who's kind of familiar with Mary Daly will know that she certainly wants to say that, you know, the maleness of Jesus is an insurmountable problem. Mary Daly, no longer with us, unfortunately, but writes this really brilliant book, Beyond God the Father, in which she says that this appeal to the uniqueness of Jesus. Jesus is a one-off example of God's self-disclosure in history, in time, is problematic according to Daly. So she completely agrees with Daphne Hampson. And the reason that it's important for Mary, is completely insurmountable for Mary Daly, is because if we have a unique male saviour, then that legitimises male superiority. End of, according to Mary Daly. And she plays around with language quite a lot, Mary Daly, and one of the things she does is rename Christology, which is, you know, basically what Christians believe about Jesus, as Christolatry, trying to draw our attention to the fact that it's a form of idolatry. Why? Well, because to say that Jesus is the unique expression of God in time, and that Jesus, and understanding that Jesus is male, is to venerate maleness to a divine level. And she puts this in another way, which I'm sure you're familiar with. If God is male, then the male is God. So she wants to kind of take exception to the maleness of Jesus, but Rosemary Radford Ruther certainly doesn't. So Ruther, a Catholic feminist Christian living in America, written on a number of theological issues, Christology, what Christians believe about Jesus, has been one of those topics that she's written on. And she actually says that people like Hampson and Daly have got it wrong. Actually, it's not the man that's the important thing in many ways. It's the message. So it's not the maleness of Jesus that is redemptive. It's what Jesus teaches. It's his message. It's his praxis even. And by praxis, she means the way in which Jesus works out his commitments and his values in his actions, in his ministry and what he does. And that's quite radical, according to Ruth, though. How Jesus acts and behaves is quite radical. Jesus' ministry and praxis, she says, model a new humanity. What she means by that is a new way of being authentically human. So contrary to what Hampson actually says, Ruther believes that it's the message rather than Jesus' maleness that redeems. The historical Jesus, she says, shows us a model of redemptive personhood that calls sex and patriarchy into redemption. And she says all we need to do is go back and look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, as it says there on the screen, and we can see that the figure that emerges, this figure of Jesus that emerges, is, to quote her, remarkably compatible with feminism. Why does she say that this Jesus figure is remarkably compatible with feminism? Well, in many ways, because Jesus expresses a radical view of God's intended reign, God's kingdom. This reign, this kingdom, this new order that Jesus believes is imminent, is an order where the last will be first and the first will be last, where the poor will be vindicated and where the oppressed will be set free. Jesus has a ministry of radical inclusion, according to Ruther. And she also wants to say that Jesus challenges the religious authorities of his time. He actually says that prostitutes, publicans, Samaritans, and other groups that society disses are actually hearing the message that Jesus discloses, whereas those in power, religious authorities, completely have not understood and are completely ignorant. She also says that, you know, one of the radical things about Jesus is that he almost gives up his male privilege. She talks about this term kenosis. I haven't written it on the screen, sorry about that, but it basically means self-emptying, and that Jesus as a man in first century Palestine, when males were dominating, to be a man who stresses service rather than domination and power is quite a radical thing, and it means that Jesus almost kind of gives up his privilege, he empties it out. And this trope of servanthood is quite important. She says that actually what it means is that, you know, to be a servant of Jesus and to be a servant of God actually means that we are to be servants alongside one another, you and me together, equally alongside one another. It doesn't mean that you have the rights now to dominate me, because you're not, that's not service that you're showing me. So actually to follow God and to be a servant of God like Jesus was is to adopt mutuality as a value, to be equal with others rather than seek to dominate them, she says. The other thing that she draws attention to is Jesus's interactions with women, which she sees to be quite radical in many ways. Jesus speaks at the well with the Samaritan woman, and she talks about other examples as well. This kind of behaviour is not expected of Jesus. It goes against cultural norms, and Jesus is prepared to do that. She therefore kind of ends by framing Jesus as a liberator who, to quote her, calls for a renunciation, a dissolution of the web of status relationships by which societies have defined privilege and deprivation. His ability to speak as liberator, she says, doesn't reside in his maleness. So it's not the maleness of Jesus that's significant, but in the fact that he has renounced this system of domination, male domination, and seeks to embody in his person the new humanity. This is a new humanity which is characterised by service and mutuality, by service and mutual empowerment, she says. The critical thing about Ruther, though, is that she kind of takes on board Hampson's critique about the uniqueness of Jesus and says that we can all follow this example of service and of being kind of practicing mutuality and mutual empowerment. Jesus isn't the only person who can demonstrate this. So when we demonstrate it in our day-to-day lives with one another, we actually make Christ present all over again. We continue Christ in the here and now. We manifest and represent this new humanity that Jesus also represented back in the first century. So Jesus, she says, is not the only representation of a new humanity. Christ, the liberated humanity, is not confined to a static perfection of one person 2,000 years ago. So Hampson's got it wrong. So let's just have a look finally at Jacqueline Grant. I said I wanted to look at Jacqueline Grant. Jacqueline Grant is will offer us a slightly different take on this issue. She is a womanist theologian, so an African-American theologian doing theology from the starting point of her own experience as a black woman. And Jacqueline Grant, along with other black women, have been quite critical of white feminists like Ruther, like Daly, who seem to just talk about sexism and gender all of the time without thinking about other axes of oppression which impact on women's lives, like in Jacqueline Grant's case, racism and classism. So she's got something to say about that. She actually says, unlike Ruther, that the fact that Jesus is God and is uniquely God is actually a strong point in the Christian story. It's not a weakness, it's a strong point. And the reason that it's a strong point is because if Jesus is God and Jesus suffers through the crucifixion, then that means that God is a co-sufferer, that God understands suffering and pain and oppression. And she says in black women's lives, where they are in a minority and oppressed regularly in American society, that this notion of God as co-sufferer is deeply important because it means that God can identify with black women's suffering. God isn't distant, God is very present, and Jesus shows that that is the case. And I'll say a little bit more about that just to finish in a second. The second point that Jacqueline Grant also makes is that black women's humanity is not only diminished by sexism, but by racism and classism. So it's not just sexism, like I said, which is an issue for black women, it's also racism and classism. And feminist theologians like Ruther and Daly and even Hampson have been slow to the party in recognising issues of race and class. According to Jacqueline Grant, during the times of slavery, black women experienced Jesus as co-sufferer. As Jesus was made to suffer undeservedly, so black women experienced a similar plight, she says. Their crucifixion included things like rape, babies being sold, husbands being castrated, and other violent, murderous acts. And black women still experience suffering, she says, in the here and now, still experiencing injustice. So confessing Jesus as God witnesses to the fact that God understands and identifies with the plight of black women, with their suffering, with their pain. Like Ruther, though, she wants to say that it's the humanity of Jesus which is significant, not his maleness. The problem with Ruther, though, is that she doesn't really nuance what she means by humanity. And that's really important, according to Jacqueline Grant. We need to nuance it because humanity is often being defined as white as well as male. And black women have certainly experienced being treated as second-class citizens. Black women have been seen and continue to be seen, she says, as subhuman in white America. And we can see that historically through the period of enslavement, but we can see that also today by the way that black women are treated, she says. In the parable of the Last Judgment in the New Testament, she says Jesus identifies with the least. Who are the least within American society? Well, Jacqueline Grant says not just black people, but black women. Black women are the least of the least within American society. And if we're to understand the parable of the Last Judgment, this shows that Jesus identifies, therefore, with black women. Yep. So let's just conclude. Wendy's just held me up a sign saying stop. So let me just conclude. So where we've got to is that we've looked at lots of different examples. I want to say that Christianity does support sexism, but actually it doesn't it's not irredeemably sexist, that there is some hope. There are good theological reasons, remember, to resist sexism. We've heard from thinkers who think that actually even identifying Jesus as God is important because it shows that God is in solidarity with those who suffer. And surely we need that kind of message in our world today. Great, I'll stop there. Thanks a lot, everybody. Sorry it's been really quick and a bit of a mad run through, but thanks for your time. I think I've got some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for that fantastic talk.
Right.
The questions have been pinging in at a really remarkable rate.
I can imagine.
That's why I was keen for you to stop so that we could get to some of them.
Yeah.
We're not going to get to many, but thank you everybody for sending your questions in. Lots of questions coming in about Catholicism and the figure of Mary, and whether that figure makes Catholicism perhaps less sexist than other forms of Christianity, or more sexist.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult, you know. So there are feminist Christians, Roman Catholic feminist Christians, who, like Tina Beattie, for example, who want to say, look, you know, the figure of Mary, she's problematic, but actually it's not all bad. Even Brazilian feminist theologians like Yvonne Jabara, she's brilliant. Look at Yvonne Jabara, don't look at Tina Beattie, look at Yvonne Jabara, because she kind of wants to say that actually the figure of Mary is not irrecoverably sexist, that there is something really empowering about this woman. You know, she becomes pregnant in a really difficult time, everyone's pointing the finger at her, and yet she says, no, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get on with it, it's what I want to do, and God's chosen me to do this. So she's a figure of empowerment and can be really important for women. But there's also been, as probably, you know, those who are asking the question probably already know, that there's also been a lot of controversy around the figure of Mary, because, you know, let's be honest, you know, she's a virgin and yet she has a baby. I mean, how many of us are going to achieve that in our lifetime? It's you know, she sets up an unreachable kind of image of womanhood, which has been used to join together purity, sexual purity, with motherhood. And that's been really quite disturbing and had very negative effects on some women's lives. So, you know, it's difficult.
One questioner pointed out that you could think of Mary as a victim of rape as well.
Absolutely, yeah. She doesn't consent, does she, to having being impregnated by God the Father. It's, yeah, seen in those terms, it's a pretty unpalatable image. I agree.
Another way in which kind of patriarchy is written into Christianity in a way. Absolutely,
and celebrated then, you know, and then we get this celebration of the virgin birth, and, you know, and it's all about Jesus, and Jesus has arrived, but we kind of think, you know, let's just take a step back and think about what we're actually celebrating. Mary hasn't consented. God the Father is the only active participant in this, remember, as well. So what's it saying about human biology? God the Father does everything. Mary doesn't do anything. It's pretty, we might say, dodgy theology. Yeah.
Great. Lots of questions about the maleness of Jesus, and lots of people doing the thought experiment of, you know, how would things be different if Jesus had been female?
Yeah.
And lots of people kind of bringing out the fact that, you know, we're talking about a historical period in which patriarchy was the way society was structured. So if Jesus had been female, she would have had no power within that social situation. Yeah,
absolutely. You know, I've taught my level 6, so that's third year undergraduate students, and whenever we look at this, they all kind of say, Hannah, but, you know, yeah, all this kind of sexism stuff. But actually, you know, if Jesus had been, if God had chosen to disclose God's self as female in first century Palestine, do you think we'd have what we've got now, which is a kind of growing kind of religion? Probably not. It would have all gone a bit and, you know, they are right, clearly. But, you know, if we had our friend Daphne Hampson in the room with us, what would she say? She would say, well, let's just stop a minute, because God didn't have to become manifest in first century Palestine, did he? You know, there are other options. And if God is all-knowing and knows the kind of mess that we'd be in now about sexism and how Christianity seems to sanction it, then surely God could have chosen a better time to disclose God's self. So what's it saying that God actually chooses to become manifest in a very, very patriarchal time? For her, it's saying that God is sexist, clearly. So it's a difficult one. But, you know, we might want to think about what Ruther says. Sorry, I'll be quick. But we might want to think about what Ruther says, because she does say that there's something really important about Jesus as a man in first century Palestine, when patriarchy is dominant. giving up his male privilege and saying that actually to follow me doesn't mean, taking up arms or anything like that. It actually means serving one another. And that's quite a radical thing to do in first century when patriarchy is all around us. So maybe that's the liberating message that's so important.
Quite a lot of people interested in your views about God and God's gender, and whether God's gender matters as well.
So, my view about God and God's gender is that gender is something made up anyway. We construct gender. What it is to be a woman and what it is to be a man is all made up by us. We set ourselves little rules about what those things are, and we kind of pass them around and then convince ourselves that they're real. So the gender of God is something that we've also made up. So God is really kind of genderless or gender fluid or whatever we might want to say, actually. But I don't think it's useful. I mean, I try as much as I can to not refer to God as he, unless people who I'm talking to theoretically in the literature are actually using that, because I don't think it's helpful. We need to, and I had colleagues say, oh, Hannah, it's a bit jarring that you keep saying gods and gods, can you not kind of do that? I was like, well, I'm sorry, it's jarring, but that's exactly the point. We need to play around with God's gender, I think, so that we don't think that it's real, because it's not, in my opinion.
Somebody in the chat went so far as to say, is it perhaps sinful to think of God as male?
It is, if we're to say that, if we're just using exclusive male language for God, then I think that is sinful, because Mary Daly does have this right, I think. It is, then it becomes a form of idolatry, because and Elizabeth Johnson says a similar thing, we take what Christians have said for centuries, which is God is incomprehensible. We can't know God, because God is mystery in the end. So, who are we now to say that we've captured God in this exclusively male language and we've said that God can't move out of it? Of course, that's problematic. And yeah, I would agree that is a form of sin.
That's interesting. A good question here about how much depends on how people read the Bible, and how much they interpret the language that is in it, and how much they take it literally. This is the way the questioner's putting it. So, how much of that is part of this discussion?
Well, it definitely is, because, when feminist Christians first started kicking off about inclusive language, the backlash was all about the fact that, well, the Bible says that God is male. And the Bible says that God is King, Father, Lord, and they're male terms. And actually, the baptismal formula of Father, Son and Holy Spirit is also unchangeable. God is a father and God is a son, and we can't mess about with that. So if we have a very literalist approach to understanding the Bible, then that becomes a straitjacket. And therefore, that there's very little room for manoeuvre around that. So if we've got a very literalist approach to understanding scripture, then feminism probably is a fishbone that must stick in our throat. Maybe Hampson's got it right. But if we don't have a very literalist understanding of the Bible, and I would say that it's impossible actually to have an entirely literalist understanding of the Bible. Otherwise, many of us wouldn't be wearing the clothes that we're wearing and doing the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, because it would be absolutely impossible. Then we need to start making really difficult but really smart decisions about what we take and what we leave behind. And you might think, oh, you can't pick and mix. That's pick and mixing. Well, yeah, it is. And you know what? Christians have been doing it for centuries. It's how the Bible was put together. It's a Christian thing. It's a Christian practice. Pick and mix. Go ahead. Do it. And, Ruther makes this point, and she's right, I think, that, as long as we've got the full humanity of women as our guide, and I think that is a really important guide, then we can start looking at ideas, biblical ideas, Christian doctrinal ideas, picking them up, looking at them and thinking, is this worth it? Is it good enough? And if it's not, get rid of it. In my opinion. Yeah,
it's interesting you should say that's the guide, the full personhood of women, because a few of your questioners have been saying, well, in effect, if the Bible says that God is male, shouldn't that be the top of the hierarchy, really?
Because the Bible is a source of authority.
Yeah.
So it is to do with authority as well as interpretation. So that's a really, really brilliant question. I mean, these are absolutely brilliant questions, I have to say, you know, absolutely amazing. Yeah, there are questions about authority and you know, where does authority lie? And feminist theologians have been criticised for placing their own, so women's experience and this commitment to women's full humanity and full personhood in front of biblical authority, for example. But then, you know, the whole idea of imago Dei, image of God, is taken from the Bible. It's a biblical principle. There are lots of examples within the Christian scriptures of kind of women being there, even though they're not there very much. And there are examples of female protagonists that we might want to kind of learn from, if you like. So the Bible isn't all bad. Certainly we need to recognise that. But in terms of authority, we have to look really quite critically and with a lens of suspicion, I think, at the Bible, because it's written at a patriarchal time, presuming a male audience who agree with the patriarchal worldview. And we're not in that time anymore, so we can't just pick it up and read it and slap it down on today, otherwise we're going to have problems.
One of your questioners also picked out that the image of God as male in the Bible is only one image of God. God is also referred to as many animals, fire, water, and so on. And the comment goes on to say that if God is transcendent, therefore we can't comprehend. So we have to use these as illustrations. So the questioner says, does it matter then whether God is male or female if these are figures of speech?
Yeah, absolutely. And they are, they're illustrative, and they're brilliant illustrations. But you know what we do when we pin God down as male is that we deaden our imagination. And actually what the Bible's about is presenting us with loads of different images for God, so that our imaginations can be filled, and so that we can start to think about the fact that God really is beyond all comprehension. And the only way that we get to that conclusion is by filling our brains and our lives with multiple images of God. And the questioner is right, you know, images of different creatures, the sea, the air. This is really important stuff, because it tells us something about, a little bit about what God is like.
And other questioners have said it's not so much doctrine in the Bible that is the problem, but Christians through the centuries who are really the source of patriarchy. Yeah, you know, to a certain extent, I want to agree with that actually it's to do with the transmission, that it's to do with the centuries of patriarchal tradition which have been built up, particular interpretations, for example, of Genesis and Eve, which aren't actually there in the text, but male theologians who are informed by their own patriarchal worldview read Genesis through that and then transmit it onto their theological friends, who then transmit it again and transmit it again, and then before you know it, you've got 2,000 years of the same message being kind of passed down from generation to generation. And with all things, these things snowball and grow, and yeah, that's how kind of this toxic interpretation of Eve is certainly developed. So I agree with that to a point. I mean, but there is an argument to say that there are bits of the Bible itself which can't be kind of, you know, we can't say, well, it's to do with interpretation, it's not to do with the text. You know, when the woman in Judges 19 is raped and killed, murdered and dismembered, cut up into pieces, you know, there's not very much that interpretation is going to do to get us around the issue that is violence against a female body, which we would say today is absolutely not acceptable. So we need to be careful about just saying that it's interpretation, but it's a bit of both. Hannah, I am so sorry, and I'm so sorry everyone. We are going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for such a fantastic talk. And I will put some more of these questions that you've put to Hannah to her in a follow-up interview, which we'll record later on this week. But thank you for that. Please do fill in the feedback form. I've just put it in the chat. If you miss it in the chat, it's on Twitter as well. And just to let you know that we are uploading the webinars of these, the videos of these webinars and the videos of the follow-up interviews. So do check out our social media for the link. Please bear in mind it does take us a few days to get them up on the website, so do keep checking back. Do hope you'll be able to join us the same time next week for our senior lecturer in Christian Studies, Dr. Dawn Llewellyn, who'll be asking the question, why are we still talking about secularization? Hannah, thank you very much for a brilliant talk. Thank you all for coming, and see you next week.